institutional science is kind of an oxymoron, right? I mean, in science, you really need to be, one of the tenets of science is to be self-doubting and self-questioning and never to be sure of your own ideas, and to, if there are new observations, to shift your hypothesis. Institutions, I mean, how many of you have tried to change an institution? Like, they're really open to change. So they are, and they can't be flip-flopping on their publics. They can't lose the public trust. They can't say, oh, we got it wrong on cholesterol and fat and saturated fat. So it's very hard to change institutions. There's also just a tremendous amount of cognitive dissonance among professors in institutions to changing their ideas. I mean, this is now 3 generations of scientists who have staked their careers, and really many of them, especially earlier on, I think, really, truly, passionately, wholeheartedly believed in their hypotheses, really fell in love with their hypotheses. I think there is really now less plausible deniability, given the evidence. But still, there's a tremendous risk in saying, my entire career has been wrong. Also, big pharma against a nutritional solution. Big pharma, at its most basic level, they make money from people being sick. And they give them pills, and if you get them off pills, they no longer have an income stream. There's also all the statin drugs that are rely on the idea that lowering your LDL is meaningful to prevent heart attack risk. So therefore, according to them, lowering your LDL through diet which is achieved by by cutting out saturated fat and possibly fat overall. Lowering your saturated fat has a similar effect. And so they're very invested in the anti-saturated fat hypothesis. And this is just an interesting fact for you to know. Even though, whatever you want to say about statins and whether or not you believe the statin data, lowering LDL by diet in diet trials has never been shown to prevent cardiovascular mortality or risk. Maybe it works with drugs, but it's never been shown to work with diet. So it's the drug data that's being applied to our diet data, which is just, it's not legitimate in any way. Okay, so we also know about the influence of big food. Often people think when they first come to me and they say, well, isn't it just the big food companies? And well, of course big food has a role to play. I mean, they make this junk food, and they are all sponsoring and supporting all of the professional medical associations and the dietitians associations and the heart associations. They're all the major sponsors. So they're clearly trying to maintain guidelines that support their products. And I mean, there's just no question about that. These are the ones that are sort of the standard whipping boys and the candy companies. But it's not just them. It's also big grain, big soy, big corn. I mean, the American Soybean Association is a huge powerhouse in the U.S. and in other places. And actually, one of the things that you've seen in all of our guidelines recently is that they're recommending more and more, not just soybean oil, but now soy products have managed to sneak their way into the protein category. So now they're recommending soy products as a legitimate way to get your protein. So all these companies are involved. And of course, the vegetable oil companies, some small little minor players on the world stage, like ADM, Monsanto, Unilever. Unilever and Bunge fund a lot of the science at Harvard. Harvard is responsible for most of the papers coming out in the last couple of years insisting that polyunsaturated fats are better than saturated fats. Unilever and Bunge also fund Tufts, who are saying the same thing. And this is just an example of Nestle, which is some companies are perfectly vertically integrated. Nestle makes, they started off with sweetened milk for babies to replace breast milk that's sweetened with sugar. And so they have all the products to get you fat. And now they have all the products, once you're fat and obese, that you can use to try to lose weight. There are these other products with soy flavone isolates, so they have a kind of cradle-to-death model. But, I have to say that ultimately I blame the experts. Ultimately, these are the people who sit on the expert committees. Every country has a committee like this, where experts from universities sit on a committee and sort through the science and say, this is what the science says. And these are the people who are responsible for deciding, okay, this study is not legitimate because it's funded by a vegetable oil company, or this. I mean, they're the ultimate gatekeepers, and they should be the ones who are the guardians of our public health. Well, this is Alice Lichtenstein, funded by Bunge, who's from Tufts, and I have on the record saying, that saturated fat limit that we have, we just pulled it out of thin air. There's no data for that number, for the 7% or 8% or 9% limit on saturated fats. But she is vehemently, all her life, anti-saturated fats. That's Frank Hu over there on the right of that other picture. He's Harvard, funded by Unilever and Bunge. He's one of the people who publishes all the papers constantly saying that polyunsaturated fats are better than saturated fats. He was in charge of the saturated fat review for the dietary guidelines in the last go-around. So, I mean, these are the people that are making these decisions, and they're obviously not, unbiased. So now I just want to talk a little bit about, what are the types? We are the barbarians at the gate, sort of saying, hey, this is not good science. And what are the tactics that are used to prevent us from being part of this conversation, from trying to change things? There are really many of the tactics that are taken straight out of the tobacco industry playbook. So one of them is to put an effort to portray the science is settled. It is settled. We all agree. These are people who have consensus conferences, and they come out with statements. This is the True Health Initiative led by David Katz, supposedly from Yale. And, they have hundreds of doctors and people saying, we agree. And we are right. And stop listening to those people who are just confusing the public. And this is a very powerful group. Many of these are vegetarians who you will see later in the lecture. So, and they will also attack people with different ideas. So David Katz, again, there he is, supposedly from Yale. He's written a number of columns going after me, and he was quoted in The Guardian telling reporters, she is an animal, unlike anything I've ever seen before. It's actually a tactic they used the Nazis used, and anybody uses to try to demonize people to sort of create parallels with small rodent animals. Silencing the science also has a long history. Silencing the science has been done not only by external people, but also by the scientists themselves who simply cannot believe their own studies. It's called selection bias, is sort of the term for it. I'm going to tell you this one story with that man, Ivan France. He was one of the leaders of this is because it's the most incredible example of a selection bias that I've ever encountered. He ran the biggest ever test of Ansel Keys' hypothesis, called the Minnesota Coronary Survey, on over 9,000 men and women in institutionalized mental hospital settings, so very highly controlled. They're controlling all their meals. You can't do that kind of experiment today because it's considered unethical, but they did it, and they did it for 4.5 years. Just like, there's just hardly a trial, I think, in the world that has run that long, that big, that well controlled. And at the end of that study, so half the people got the kind of diet we're recommended now, 9% saturated fat. They had low-fat milk, soy-filled cheese, soy-filled burgers, whatever horrible foods they had to deal with. And then the other people got regular meat, regular cheese, regular whole fat, and they had 18% saturated fat, which is considered outrageous today. But that was considered normal in the day. This was conducted in the 1960s. Funded by the National Institute of Health. At the end of that study, they found there was no benefit from being on the vegetable oil diet, from lowering your saturated fat and replacing it with polyunsaturated fat. And they didn't publish those results for 16 years, which, in science is a kind of fraud, really. It's you're not supposed to do that. And when they did finally publish them, they put them in a sort of out-of-the-way journal that they knew nobody would read, and they just sort of disappeared. And much later, when Gary Taubes actually asked Ivan France, why didn't you publish your results? he said, well, there was just nothing wrong with the study. We were just so disappointed in the way it came out. So, I mean, this is like incredible selection bias. These are scientists who just don't believe their own results. And actually, in 2015, some researchers went back and found Ivan France's son and found that Ivan France still had the original magnetic tapes from that study in his basement, and went through all the tapes, found reanalyzed all the data, and discovered that actually the more the men lowered their cholesterol, the more likely they were to die of a heart attack, which had never been reported in the original paper. Anyway, that study was just never part of the literature or conversation. Nobody talked about it. Also, the Women's Health Initiative, another what's called silent studies. They just disappear. Nobody talks about them. The Women's Health Initiative is the biggest ever nutrition trial ever undertaken in the history of nutrition studies on 49,000 women on the low-fat diet. With the results that came out in 2006, and has found that the low-fat diet had no benefit for anything: obesity, diabetes, heart disease, nor any kind of cancer. So this is, and that again, that study also, nobody talks about that study, or they find a litany of things that must have been wrong with it, so they can just find ways of dismissing it. You know, the flip side of that is that people who have low carb studies find their work very hard to get published, very hard to get anything into journals, and that's because the Alice Lichtensteins and Frank Hu's of the world sit on all those editorial boards, and it's just very hard to get this science to rise. So how else do you silence the science? Well, you can try to get it retracted. So, and this is an article that I did for the BMJ that came out in 2015. It was a cover story, and it really analyzed all the science behind our dietary guidelines. I mean, literally, I went through, for every key recommendation, I created a spreadsheet and went through every single study that they cited, and found that, for instance, their recommended Mediterranean diet, there's only one study on 250 people. For the vegetarian diet they recommend, 0 clinical trials. For the, so I mean, it just was, what they rely almost exclusively on this really weak form of science called epidemiology, which can only show association and not causation. And all those big clinical trials, the Women's Health Initiative, the Minnesota Coronary Survey I'm just telling you about, never reviewed them, never cite them, not there. Ever, not in the history of the dietary guidelines, going back to 1980. So, of course, everybody really loved that article, and I was welcomed with open arms. So again, Center for Science of the Public Interest, the advocacy group that's very close with the government, they rounded up 180 people, scientists mostly, to ask for retraction, including all the U.S. Dietary Guideline Committee, saying that it was too flawed, it was riddled with errors, and there were so many flaws. And I should say this is after the whole regular review process, where people write in letters and you respond to their queries, and they say this is wrong, and I was able to refute really everything, all the critiques of the paper. This went on for a year. The BMJ put it to an outside committee, and they a year I didn't sleep, and but at the end of it, the BMJ stood by it, and they said, we had minor corrections that had no bearing on any of the allegations in the article, and they stood by the article and did not retract it. So, yay for that. Thank you. So, more of my own experience. I mean, I'm sure you've heard of the disinvitation as a way of preventing ideas from being heard. Well, that's happened to me too, which is that one of the most prestigious and most influential food policy conferences in the U.S. takes place in Washington, D.C., and it's been going on for 35 years. It's been run by one person, and then there's a new person installed to run that in 2016, I guess, and he was brand new to the whole field, really didn't know what he was getting into. I sent him my book. I was like, maybe he'll invite me. And he called me back. He's like, I loved your book. It's so provocative and interesting. And we've had somebody drop out on this panel. Why don't you come and join? I think it would be great to have a fresh point of view. So I said, sure, great. I'd love to do that. Thanks. And I said, who are the other members on the committee? And he says, well, there's 3 other members. One is the head of the U.S. Dietary Guideline Committee. The other is the head of the CSPI, the group that organized the retraction letter against me, that head of that group, and then the head of the dietary guidelines at USDA. So I was like, that'll be great. So, so I hung up the phone and I turned to my husband and I said, how long do you think it'll be until he calls me back and disinvites me from that? So sure enough, 9 o'clock the next morning, there he is, hi Tom, calling me on the phone. He says, the other 3 members have said they will refuse to come if you are on the panel. So I'm really sorry, but we're going to disinvite you. I thought that was terrible, but there was nothing I could do. A friend in Ireland started a petition. We got almost 4,500 signatures for it in the course of a week, but I was not reinstated on that panel. So and I want to just say there's also this whole other area of advocacy defending the so-called plant-based diet, and this is the animal welfare people. A lot of them now masquerading as doctors who are using vegan diets as a way to push forward the animal welfare agenda. There's a social justice component to it, because meat consumes too many of the Earth's resources, so we all must eat grains because that's more fair. And then the environmental groups who have really rallied behind this idea that cows drive global warming. Which, I don't think there's any good science for that. But, there's all these groups have really come together to be a very, very powerful force, especially in the United States. And it's sort of united around this triumvirate of, do good and feel good and be good to the planet, which is like fantastic little PR campaign. But they're very powerful, and they really have all this support by the vegan diet doctors. These are very powerful men: Cleveland Clinic, Caldwell Esselstyn, Dean Ornish, Dr. Tu, many people who've suffered death and disease. But no, anyway, sorry about that. No, he was Clinton's doctor. I mean, he has been at this since the early 1970s, and he is at every elite gathering, Davos, TED, Ideas Festival, every elite. He's really been networking his way into the elite for decades. And they're also united. There's a kind of these diet doctors are now united with much more mainstream folks. So again, Frank Hu, vegetarian at Harvard, Walter Willett, who's run the Harvard department. All these people are part of a number of different groups. One of them where they come together under is this American College of Lifestyle Medicine, which I believe Belinda Fettke is going to tell us about this. I think they're either largely supported or owned by the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which is a vegetarian group. Anyway, and our friend David Katz is there. And so there's just this real convergence of elite and fringe groups that are all united around this plant-based diet. And this group, of course, also receives a lot of money from all those companies that we've been talking about, the grain-based companies. So what can we do? It is, that's a formidable lineup of forces, and it's very intimidating. I think the first thing is you're here for yourself and your own health, and it's really important to learn about that and take care of the people that you love and around you. Take a book to your doctor. You can take my book. You can take another book. Try to convince people in your community. And if you want to get involved in advocacy for change, you can give me your business card or your email address. And I've started this group called the Nutrition Coalition because I really believe that there just has to be change, and that it has to be organized change. And so this is a not-for-profit group. We don't take any money from any interested industry. And we started working in Washington. Why in Washington? Well, this is our theory of change. There is a limited number of people who are willing to stand up to authority, like us. You are a relatively rare group of maverick people with open minds, and you're willing to entertain different ideas. Many people are not. This is me and my mother. So I routinely go home to my mother's house and I'm like, hey, Mom, how about not having low-fat yogurt in the morning and with all that sugar? And she's like, okay, Nina, I'll ask my doctor about that. I'm like, I know a little something about nutrition. And she's like, they're just people who are never going to do anything without their doctor's stamp of approval. And the other thing, there's just a lot of rules about what doctors, nutritionists, dietitians are allowed to say and do. You know, I know many doctors who are part of big medical practices, and they say, I am not allowed to hand out, you know, information on low carb. It's simply not allowed. And that is because it's a very top-down system. There's a fear of being sued and legal issues, and there's just a lot of, so really, and you know, the source of all that bad advice, what is at the top, is the dietary guidelines. It's what I call the evil Death Star of all bad advice, and everything flows down from there. You know, all the medical associations, everybody, they just download the guidelines and then they spread it out to everybody. So even if you feel like, I don't go to a .gov website to find my advice, that advice finds you through every healthcare practitioner on the front line. That's where they get their information. And I should say that it started in America, and we have also, we spread it out all over the world, but it really all began in America. So I'm truly sorry for that.